Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the first stream from Open Dialoges, in what will be a regular series of interesting conversations about topics that really matter. And on our first one, I guess it's inevitable that we had to talk about the thing that no one's really stopped talking about all year, which is COVID-19. Now, to discuss this, I would like to introduce my two special guests this evening. First of all, we have Bill Etheridge. Bill is a former UKIP MEP from the West Midlands. So very welcome to you, Bill.
Thank you.
And we also have then from the sturgeon paradise that is Scotland, we have Mitch William, who's a political commentator and who seems to have survived despite the junta under which he lives. So a very warm welcome to you as well, Mitch.
Thank you very much.
Now, to get to the topic here, guys, as I say, you couldn't have lived on planet Earth this year and not been aware that COVID was going to be the single biggest thing, not to just dominate our lives, but to change our lives in ways I guess nobody saw back in February of this year. But nonetheless, it's happened. So what I wanted to do is to start off. Oh, I think we have somebody. We have Sammy Wilson. Very welcome. Can you? I'm very well. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Yeah, listen, Sammy, we've just started, but you're extremely welcome onto the stream. And with one leap, Northern Ireland now dominates with two representatives versus the Scotsman and the Englishman. So Sammy, it's good to see you.
Don't be Irish, Scotsman and Englishman.
The only thing that's missing is a Welshman, but they're all under arrest at the moment.
They're not allowed to cross the border.
I know. I know. We'll, I'm sure we'll get to that, Sammy. But listen, thanks for coming on this. And as I said, this is being recorded, so just so that you know. So, what I was sort of saying was that 2020 has been all about essentially one thing, which is something we never saw back in even February, which is COVID-19. And so we've got Mitch from Scotland, Bill here from England, and yourself. And really, what I wanted to talk about was, and start with you, Sammy. Actually, I should introduce Sammy. For those who don't know Sammy Wilson, Sammy has been an MP for East Antrim for 15 years now, Sammy.
Yeah.
And prior to that, he held ministerial office in the Stormont Assembly. So Sammy's a prominent figure in the DUP, which of course is the lead party in the Northern Ireland Executive. So that's Sammy in a couple of sentences. A very experienced and senior politician. So as I said, Sammy, we never seen this coming, and here we are at the end of October, basically. And I wanted to talk about with the guys in each of the individual countries of the UK, what their thoughts are, what your thoughts are in terms of, how do you think this has impacted in Northern Ireland? What do you think have been the big lessons? What are the learnings? What are the mistakes? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that, first of all, the impact in Northern Ireland has probably been greater than the impact in other parts of the United Kingdom. Because, of course, we turned a health crisis into an economic crisis. And our economy was already extremely fragile for all of reasons which I'm not going to discuss now. But we now have a situation where many of our businesses, as in other parts of the United Kingdom, are under threat, where unemployment has doubled, where youth unemployment is soaring, where we have the lowest level of vacancies, and we still seem to be using the same tactics as we used at the very start of this crisis, namely that you close down the economy, you stop people doing the things that as humans we want to do, have social interaction in order to deal with a virus, which, like any other virus, if it's passed on through social contact, then the only way you're going to stop it is either to stop all social contact, which in a democracy cannot do, and which no sane person would want to do anyway, or else you learn to live with it. And we have not even started to try to consider how we learn to live with it, just as we learned to live with the flu. We've learned to live with other serious illnesses and infectious diseases. But we seem to think that somehow or other, and I think that this is partly due to Boris Johnson's declaration of war against this virus, and he was going to stop it and everything else, that kind of nonsense. But we have now followed the logic of that, which is we think that by closing everything down, we can somehow or other deal with this. And in the meantime, of course, I did a radio interview this morning, and they were saying, you're concerned about all these deaths. And the point I was making to them was, look, you report on a daily basis the COVID deaths, but you don't report the deaths from cancer, which is not being treated, heart problems, which are not being treated, people who are scared to leave the house or unable to get access to a hospital, and the 25,000 people across the United Kingdom who have died at home, many of whom probably could have been saved had the health service not been obsessed with coronavirus. So, I think that we have now become, we've become focused on this one thing at the expense of the breadth of the health service and at the expense of the economy.
I think, Sammy, yes, I'm aware of the interview you did this morning. And actually, in a way, it sums up one of the things I want to get through in this debate, because you raised some very sensible, rational points. And I've seen the barrage of abuse that's been directed your way, which doesn't lead to any possibility of trying to move things on then. So it's very difficult when people do raise sensible points that you're instantly, demonized as, oh, he doesn't care about people. Of course you do. We all do.
Yeah, and David, I just make 2 points on that. I mean, first of all, as a public representative, of course I care about my constituents. Otherwise I wouldn't get elected, for goodness sake. And the second thing is that as part of the reaction, and I know the kind of reaction that an interview like that gets, but that's partly because we have now created a culture of fear in this country, where if anybody challenges the established wisdom of the experts and the recommendations which they make, then people are afraid that by challenging that and by suggesting something different, you're going to kill them all. I mean, I do get people saying, if they followed what you're saying, Sammy, we'd all be dead. In fact, some man said to me, because I made some comment about Christmas, someone said to me afterwards in the street, I met him and he said, if we don't do what the health minister and his advisors say, this Christmas will not be here next Christmas anyway. Now, see, when you instill that kind of fear in people, then that's why you get the reaction to an interview like I gave this morning, such as you've described.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sammy, you mentioned Boris Johnson's declaration of war on the virus. Bill, can I ask? I mean, obviously, you're living in England in the West Midlands, and so you're experiencing all the fun and games of tier 3, or is it tier 2 or tier 1? I'm not sure. So how do you think things have been dealt with in England, particularly under Boris?
Well, we've been subject to the same kind of panic and intimidation as has been discussed in Sammy's earlier answer. I think one of the major concerns that there is this fact that if you do try and speak out, if you question it, even if you actually politely say, look, there are alternatives to this, you get slammed, you get attacked, there's real hostility. And people, certainly in the West Midlands, and I think wider afield in England, are starting in increasing numbers now to question what is going on. If you lock people in, I mean, we're currently in my part of the West Midlands just about being moved into level 2, which is going to be the same as the rest of the West Midlands. And the expectation is that that's just a build up to take us into level 3. And you keep on building this up and building this up, building the terror up. Without justifying yourself, other than saying, as Sammy said, other than saying, you're all going to die if you don't do what you're told, certain people will start to question it, start to ask questions. And we even had today in the news, the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner quoted as saying that he would send the police out to break up Christmas dinners
Yeah.
I mean, this is insane. This is beyond anything any fascist state or communist state would have dreamt of. You know, and this is getting to such an extreme point. Views are getting so polarized. I honestly think that the handling by the government of this crisis is going to lead to serious trouble, serious civil unrest at some point, because not only are we having our freedoms and liberty taken from us at an alarming rate, but actually they're about to make 4 to 5 million people unemployed. And areas like the West Midlands, which, you know, we barely limped out of the last recession, you know, we're going to be hit even harder. So you're hitting us while we're down with a massive self-inflicted recession, actually born out of panic, desperation and fear, which could have been avoided. I believe in a few months' time, this is going to get so serious that we're going to see real trouble, and it's entirely at the door of the government as to why this is happening.
Well, I mean, can I then extend the conversation to Mitch? Because, as I say, we have no one from Wales on the basis that I think they're all under arrest. But Scotland under Nicola doesn't seem that much better. So what's been your experience up there?
Well, at the moment, the Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP seem to be trying to out-tier England. I don't think they're too focused on Wales, but it's more like, yeah, we don't like the English. Oh, we're going to out-tier England. So as of the 2nd of November, the 5-tier system is going to be in place, which puts 3.3 million people into the Tier 4 category, which closes most of hospitality and is not quite a lockdown, but almost a lockdown.
Yeah.
To be honest, Scotland's hospitality industry is on its knees at the moment, and everybody is getting increasingly frustrated with the situation. If you look at the figures, April 1st in Scotland, we had 400 cases. October 10th, it was creeping up to 1,800. Today, there's been 28 deaths and 1,202 new cases. It's clear that lockdowns don't work. So perhaps we do need to look at other avenues and broaden our scope.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things for me is that Scotland's synonymous with tourism and hospitality. And when you have a country more or less closed down, and it's the same here, Sammy, as well, to a significant degree, you know, if you close down sectors of the economy, that's really damaging, and it's just not, it's surely not sustainable, is it, Sammy Wilson?
No, it's not. And David, if you actually look at the assessments that have been given by the Chief Medical Officer, those assessments, anyone reading those assessments and reading the evidence they gives would never have made the decisions that we have made about the hospitality industry, or indeed hairdressers or things like that. Because first of all, the impact on the R rate is quite minuscule. Secondly, in both those cases, the Chief Medical Officer has admitted that there is no clear evidence that they're the chief spreaders of the disease. Indeed, in the case of the hairdressers, he actually makes the comment that most of them have put in safety measures, and no hairdressers have contracted coronavirus. And in the case of the hospitality industry, and this is a direct quote from the evidence he gave, there is anecdotal evidence from Holland that, and on the basis of anecdotal evidence, he recommended the closure of a major industry. On thousands of people's jobs depend, and which was already quite fragile because it was lost in the summer season on the tourist industry as well. And if we're going to deal with this, I mean, it's quite clear. I mean, we've had examples here in Northern Ireland where some pubs have allowed celebrations after Gaelic matches and football matches, and people got together, all jumping, hugging each other and everything else. Where it is clear that someone is breaking the rules, then of course target them. But don't use the sledgehammer and beat everybody who is trying to abide by the regulations and the rules. And not be one way, for example, of targeting actions. And secondly, I think that I look at my own constituency here. At one stage in my own constituency, we were the highest rate, and it was they identified it to a meat plant in Ballina. Now, once we dealt with that, we came down to the second lowest. So again, you know, if you identify where the infections are coming from, then use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to deal with some of these things, and that avoids closure. So, I mean, I'm not saying you don't take action. All I'm saying is, look, take action sensible, an action which is not going to create even bigger problems.
Well, actually, and that's interesting, Sammy, because that brings us on to really the broader picture, which is some of you may be aware of the fact that at the beginning of this month, a number of esteemed epidemiologists and virologists and scientists got together over in the States, and they released a document called the Great Barrignton Declaration. Now, the Great Barrignton Declaration, to put it, just summarize it very simply, is to say that there is other ways of dealing with these kind of pandemics, these kind of infections, and that a better approach might be to look at how we can protect the most vulnerable people, you know, the vulnerable groups that we now know about that we didn't know back in March, and at the same time allow other people to get on with their life. Bill, what's your views on that kind of approach? Do you think that's something we should be looking at?
I think it's the only approach that's going to work. This is a force of nature that's been unleashed. Now, whether or not it was man-made, it's being carried on the natural process. And you know, lockdowns, I mean, crikey, we've had so many different tiers of lockdowns, so many different measures over the whole course of this year. And all they've actually achieved is to wreck the economy. They haven't stopped the spread of the virus. And even if they were to, all it does is kick the can down the road, because eventually you've got to emerge from your bunker. So it doesn't make sense. The only way that this can really be dealt with, and for the whole of our nation to actually still prosper and be an effective society and democracy, is if we actually accept the fact it's here. We do things to allow those who are vulnerable, be it the elderly or the frail or the ill, to be protected, should they wish to be. And that's another factor, because I don't think many pensioners necessarily want to be under house arrest. I certainly referenced my own father in that, who came out playing badminton with me last night. He's 79, you know, and it does him more harm. Well, he's fitter than me, I'll give him that. It does him more harm to actually be stuck in his house, doing nothing, watching his life tick away, than it would do for him to get out there and do things. So in reality, to summarize my view on this, I think the Great Barrignton Declaration is not only an option, it's the only option I think that is reasonable, realistic, and that we should pursue. And we must not allow this constant house arrest of whole nations to continue, because it's going to lead to far more deaths than COVID ever could.
And Bill, you have there that if you use the lockdown approach, I mean, our health minister is already talking about it. Not one lockdown, a series of lockdowns. Because what happens is you may well, by keeping people in their houses and stopping them going to school and stopping them going to the shops and stopping them going to the pub and everything else, you may well slow down the infection for the period you do that. But as soon as you allow people to socialise again, you're going to. I used to have an old car, which I drove around all the time, and it had a hole in the radiator. And I used to, rather than take the thing out and get it fixed, I just kept driving and put water in it, and it would overheat. I always knew it was going to overheat. So you put the water in, you had to stop it for a while, let it cool down, and then you put water in. And I think that's what they're doing with the economy. That's what they're doing now. Rather than saying, look, there's a problem here, we've got to address it. We've got to, and the suggestions which you've talked about there is the right way of doing it. Rather than do it, we pour some water in, and then when it overheats again, we stop it again, and we pour some water in, it overheats again. We'll be doing this in 10 years' time if we keep. I
think also what Sammy and Bill, one of the issues is, and I'll turn this one to you, Mitch, that the people who favour the lockdown strategy do tend to keep talking about how they care so much, as if people like us don't. And of course we do. And I was interested to read today, Mitch, that in Scotland, I see the figures have come out that showed that when the Scottish government were pushing people out of the NHS hospitals in Scotland into care homes back, which was essentially a killing field, they weren't even testing the people to see, did they have COVID? So, there's a certain heartlessness amongst the people who are actually at the same time telling us that they care more than anybody. What's your thoughts on that, and from a Scottish perspective?
That is absolutely horrendous that we're pushing people into the care homes without giving them tests. That the care home deaths was an absolute major scandal. They even done a TV ad on it, where the care home directors and staff were actually done by actors, and it was just obviously a horrendous situation to be in.
Yeah, I think the thing is that I think there's an agreement amongst us that we can't keep going the way we are. And Sammy, you've been very, very clear in that, and very, 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 to the point. But why do you think then that when people like these epidemiologists and scientists at Great Barrignton do come up with a different strategy, it's dismissed out of hand by Matt Hancock? I doubt that Robin Swan has even heard of it, Sammy, but on the off chance that he has, I don't think he would be going with that. Why, Sammy, do you think there is a rejection of different approaches? Why do we keep going down this tunnel?
Well, I think there are two reasons for it. And if I look at it from the technical point of view, chief medical officers and whatnot, first of all, they recommended lockdowns, and people made huge sacrifices for those lockdowns. I think that there's almost a fear now that if they admit that, look, that perhaps wasn't the wisest of recommendations, we probably shouldn't have done that, then they'll have all kinds of criticism heaped on. And so they're on a treadmill now where they made this recommendation. The people made sacrifices. People are angry about the sacrifices they've had to make and everything else. And how do you admit you're wrong on this? And professionals aren't good at this. I mean, David Ferguson got the foot and mouth disease thing all wrong as well, but never apologized for it. I think so. They've made these predictions, and you look, David. Even when they made predictions of 500,000 deaths, have they recovered from that? No, they haven't.
No.
Use these computer models. So that's from the experts' point of view. I think that's where the fear. And I'll tell you, and I've spoken to many politicians, including politicians who I'm very close to in Northern Ireland. And from a politician's point of view, there's a fear that if you do something different and people die, and the fact is people are going to die. So if you do something different and people die, then immediately somebody's going to point a finger at you. And how do you disprove this and say, my mother wouldn't have died or my father wouldn't have died if you hadn't changed your policy? So therefore, better to keep on with what they've been doing rather than do something different, especially if you know people are going to die, because nobody wants to be accused of being responsible for deaths. So you've got the experts on a treadmill, you've got the politicians on a treadmill, and that's and so what do? They're then rubbish in their opinions rather than examine.
Well, Sammy, I mean, those are two great points, and Bill, I mean, if you were in political position, I mean, what would you do different? Because you've got those massive pressures that Sammy's just, pointed out. If you admit that you got it wrong, then what does that mean in terms of people who have lost their lives? And the experts aren't going to admit. Neil Ferguson and the gang at Imperial College aren't going to admit that they got it wrong. So from a political point of view, what would you do?
Well, I wouldn't have backed myself into this corner in the first place, but I think Sammy's making a good point about the short term of this, because were there to be an immediate U-turn on this, and let's face it, this is a government that quite enjoys U-turns, but I don't think it can on this, because it's not just the so-called experts will have egg on their face, there will have to be ministerial sackings. And even to the point of, you go right to the top, they're head first on this course. But the trouble is, this is only a short-term scenario where they escape the wrath of the British people, because in 6 months' time, or maybe even sooner, the repercussions of what they've done are going to be so huge in terms of societal and economic damage that it will make what has happened so far look like a picnic. And the one other thing I want to pick up on was when Mitch mentioned before about, and yourself, about the care homes. When you saw originally the care home, the death figures spiking, I've had anecdotal evidence from NHS professionals who, we all know what happens to NHS whistleblowers. You know, they don't work again, so they come to me and they tell me, and I try and tell people, and I'm accused of being a liar. But I've been told from several hospitals that happened in England as well. They were rushed out into their care homes untested, and you saw a blip in the figures going up of deaths, you know, unsurprisingly. But what's happened since, if you look at the death rate and the number of deaths going on since then, we're actually below the amount of deaths for many of those months that would have been expected in a normal year. So this situation has been caused from start to where we are by the government being inept at handling the health service and taking so-called expert advice. For the good of the country, I mean, they always talk about in the national interest. It's a big phrase that's always used. Well, in the national interest, regardless of the personal political consequences, they should man up and say, we got this wrong, and stop before they take us to complete catastrophe, which is literally around the corner.
Well, actually, I mean, based on what you've just said, Bill, and if you look, Mitch, at, for example, the situation in Scotland and what's happening there, how is it that it appears that Nicola Sturgeon's popularity is quite high? People seem to like the fact that she's actually doing the very things that Sammy and Bill think she shouldn't be doing, but yet her popularity, if we believe all that we see in the TV and read, is that an illusion? How does that work out?
Nicola Sturgeon's daily COVID briefing should really be called the SNP party political broadcasts, because that's essentially go on, bash Westminster, and then outdo Westminster, and everybody's still in this bubble of we need lockdown. So some people maybe even think we need more lockdown. So at the moment, public opinion, unfortunately for me, is swaying in favour of Nicola Sturgeon and her policies. For instance, her hardcore support. It's like the English have got 3 tiers, the Scottish have got 5. We've got to do better than the English, etc., etc. But I don't think we can carry on much longer like this. If we continue down the same road, we're going to be in lockdown 2022, lockdown 2023. Like Bill said earlier, reference the possibility of civil disorder. Well, Wales will be the first constituent nation to go into civil disorder with lockdown measures there.
Well, actually, just on that. Sorry, Sammy, go ahead.
I mean, there's quite a lot of resistance to these measures now in Northern Ireland. And, you know, whilst there are people who'll criticise you for saying that you shouldn't have lockdown and everything else, there's an equal proportion of the people who are saying that this is wrecking us, and also are concerned about freedoms having been taken from them, and how do they get them back again. Now, I mean, I always identified Scottish people with being free-spirited, wanting to, you know, do their, don't like control placed on them and everything else. Is there no resistance, widespread public resistance to these draconian measures in Scotland?
Not that I've seen, to be honest. Any resistance is quite small scale, to be fair. There's no massive movement, as like how, for instance, you've got some movements in England, etc., who have had like anti-mask parades, etc. I've not seen any of that up north.
And that fascinates me as well, actually. But you know, you do wonder how people go along with it. But maybe, Sammy, maybe the reason that there is a lack of what you would think is logical resistance, kickback, is that media, our friends in the media, and the BBC, and Sky, and all across the mainstream media, I mean, they push out a narrative 24/7, which is about the very fear that I think people need to be released from. But they push it. They're fear mongers, in my view, and but they do it, and a lot of people, whether we like it or not, tune in, to the BBC at lunchtime, at tea time, and they get this whole narrative that this is even the second wave's worse than the first wave, even though it's very debatable to what scale we have a second wave, if at all. And Sammy, that's the big thing, isn't it? It's the media are casting almost a spell over people in Scotland and Northern Ireland and in England and maybe even in Wales, and they can't seem to get out of it.
So you hear.
Yeah, and I do think that's right, that right across the media, that only one narrative is acceptable. And indeed, I know from the interviews, and I mean, I skeptical of this from the very start, and the measures being taken. And I know the hostility that you get from interviewers when you're doing interviews. And, I compare the hostility to interviews which I would do, and then the kind of almost the fawning attitude that there is to people who take the establishment view. So yes, you're almost, and that reinforces the views amongst the population. However, David, I mean, I still do think that people ask about liberties. I mean, people, and maybe I only get it from people because people know how I think, and maybe people address you and are more willing to talk to you because they know how you think. But I mean, the number of people who've said to me, who would ever thought that in a democracy like ours they would have stopped you in a church? Who ever thought that in a country like ours they would have insisted that you wear masks? Who ever thought that police would have come to your house and to your business if you were had more than a certain number of people in the place? Who ever thought we would be encouraging people to snoop on their neighbours?
I know.
All of these things. Now, see when those freedoms go, and I remember discussing this with the ministers when they give us briefings about the Coronavirus Act at the very start. And I'd said, look, why isn't there a sunset clause after 6 months to see how this works? And surprisingly, amongst the other parties, there wasn't a great move for that, because it was seen, oh, this is an emergency, and we don't know how a long emergency will go on. But the one thing I can tell you is, see, once freedoms are taken away from you,
you don't come back.
It's hard to get back again. And one of my colleagues was telling me that he was talking to one of the medical officers there the other day, and had asked him that question about, what stage would they contemplate lifting the regulations on masks? And his answer was very, very, well, it was appalling in my view. He said, well, maybe there'll be a societal change. And, they wear masks in Asia all the time. Maybe this will lead to a societal change where people will be quite happy to have to be wearing masks and everything else. That kind of thinking worries me. And I do fear that we have given liberties away which will not be easily got back. That worries me.
I think, Sammy, that's so true. I'm sure you'd agree, Bill. It's sad to see how, I mean, I sort of summed it up earlier. I mean, who knew that 2020 actually turns out to be 1984, which it essentially is, insofar as we live in Orwellian times where not only do people lose their freedoms and liberties, but they're almost grateful for losing their freedom and liberties. And there is a maxim, that some of you may have heard, which is that the ultimate triumph of the despot is when the slaves give thanks for their enslavement. So I see people, I saw people today out and about, outside in the fresh air when it wasn't raining, and they had their masks on outside. Bill, why do people behave like that?
Well, for a start, I agree it's ludicrous. The reason why they're doing that is because they are only seeing one side of the story. They're getting hammered home constantly, day in, day out. I mean, if you ever turn on Sky News, which is an unpleasant experience at the best of times, you see a bar running across constantly telling you about measures, deaths, all COVID related doom and gloom and disaster constantly happening. It's being rammed in, and you try and get on to put the alternative point of view on mainstream media, which I have tried. It is almost impossible. And also the other way that we would normally fight back, I mean, this little conversation we have about why aren't people fighting back? Well, I'll give you a very, very good reason. I've been contacted by dozens of people who want to organise and arrange protests, public meetings, the normal way that in this country we deal with fighting back against governments. But of course, when it comes down to it, we're all pretty scared about having a £10,000 fine. And, you know, that is not a small beer to your normal Joe on the street, and certainly not to someone like me. If it weren't for the draconian measures, we'd already see serious protest movements going on. But these measures are clamping down on free speech, taking away our liberty, as Sammy mentioned just then. Yeah, you could say 1984. You could also say 1934 with the way the propaganda is being used. It's so effective and powerful and one-sided, and such a clamp down on opposition, that I fear that what we're actually seeing is the distilling of all the dark propaganda that we've seen all throughout the last century or more into one perfect storm, which is terrifying people, not only frightened of a virus, but also terrifying the authorities.
Oh yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and when you talk about propaganda, Bill, I mean, the SNP are kind of masters of propaganda, aren't they? So, as you say, the daily briefing is essentially a little propaganda show which gets broadcast out and people watch it, I guess, Mitch, and people are massively influenced by it.
Oh yeah, and up in Scotland as well, we've even got comedians who do voiceovers of it, of Nicola Sturgeon's daily briefings. They do actually. This particular lady has become very famous out of doing this. She's done very well, but then people follow her, and then she's in favour of all the lockdowns, etc., and all the restrictions. So then it just grows. You've got comedians and politicians in tune together, and as Bill and Sammy was saying, it's the media. You turn on the news and it's telling you doom, gloom, and death all the time, and people are it's just becoming ingrained.
But the thing I wonder though is, like, people will have to wake up, because Sammy, I've been around. I'm not sure what it's like around sort of Larne and places like that, but if you go through a lot of our towns, and even Belfast, for example, you see. I went through. You probably know a place, Sammy, the Great Northern Mall. You know, beside the Europa Hotel, and there's lots of wee shops in there. All but one of them, I think, or one or two maximum, are closed. They're all vacant. They've gone. And I've saw a video of a guy walking around London looking at the the number of shops. Just the shutters were down. You know, they're gone. So the economic damage, Sammy, which is something I know that matters to you and indeed to all of us, is colossal. But it's like it's like an iceberg. It's most of it's under the water, but it's there, isn't it?
Well, it is, and you know, I think we haven't appreciated how bad the economic damage is going to be. Some of it has been masked by the furlough scheme and by the huge amounts of money that the government has been pumping into the economy. It can't keep on doing that forever. The furlough scheme will come to an end. Businesses which have been hanging on, I mean, many business people have spoken to me and said, look, you know, we're dipping into our reserves at present, hoping that this will be the last time we get locked down. You know, once they've extinguished those reserves, once they realise that actually they may face more of these closures of their businesses, or even the worst part, David, is actually not for those who have been deliberately closed and closed by regulation, because they at least get some compensation. Yeah. The ones that are worst hit are those who, as a result of those closures, then find that their business is affected, but they haven't been instructed to close. They don't get any support. I went to a shop in Larne there today to get ice cream, and the girl said to me, you know, she'd started the business there 2 years ago, done very well. Yeah. This holidays, and she said, Sammy, see all those tables there? they were usually always filled with young people. This was a congregation that came in here to sit and listen to music and they had ice cream. That was always a good wee turn for me. Says I can't have anybody in, and anyway, nobody's coming into town because if they can't go to a cafe, they just don't bother coming in. Because for a lot of people, coming in was at the town and do a wee bit of shopping, have a cup of tea, get their lunch or whatever. But if that social side of it is taken away, then they just don't bother coming in, and increasingly do their shopping on the internet or whatever. And you know, those are the wee businesses are affected. And don't forget, a lot of those people, because people always think, if you're in business, you must be rich. You're not. I mean, a lot of those people have put their life savings in their business. They don't have huge reserves. They live on a knife edge, certainly until they get established. And they're the ones which are going to disappear, but they're the ones that could lead to massive redundancies. And, you know, she pointed, she's got 2 young girls working in the shop, teenagers. If she closes or business slows down, they're the first to go. One of the reasons why youth unemployment has soared 20%.
Well, yeah. I mean, the other aspect of it, Bill, is that from what Sammy said, like the furlough scheme's about to expire. Then I know we have there's Rishi's new not just as good scheme, but like ultimately all this is essentially subsidizing the financial consequences of the government. The government's closing the shops or businesses and then essentially paying them to stay closed. But what happens when someone has to pick up the bill? Taxes are surely going to have to increase, Bill. I mean, how do you see this working out on a broader scale across the UK? Because at some point, Rishi's going to have to do a budget.
Well, as an avowed Thatcherite, you can imagine how horrified I am by the waste of money. I actually see what's going on with the furlough scheme. I mean, this is billions and billions of pounds on effectively giving people unemployment benefit at a high rate, because those jobs are going to be unemployed because of what the government's done, most of them. I think it would have been far more sensible and realistic to have spent just a few of those billions on making the NHS a bit more COVID secure, on making sure care homes were COVID secure, and making sure that those who have to shield but are of working age got some way of getting by. Then the rest of the economy could have continued, because those things that Sammy's mentioned are all spot on. You know, we're all seeing this. We're seeing family businesses and businesses that people have poured their life and soul and all their savings into being destroyed for no good reason, as far as I'm concerned. And where do I see it heading? Well, with the national debt up there, 2 trillion, with the deficit now running, I think it was 400 billion plus last time I looked. They're going to say, good old Rishi, who actually, if you close your eyes, sounds like Tony Blair, and I actually think his politics are like Tony Blair as well. I think Rishi will be there, let's put up taxes, we've got to do this. And that, again, will stifle the economy in the middle of a recession, which is absolutely bonkers. The only way forward now, taking out, of course, we've got to get rid of all these crazy regulations, but the only way to restore our economy now actually would be to say, in the short term, we've got to get rid of more regulation, we've got to cut tax levels down as far as we possibly can, get people back into work and get people spending. And then there's going to be a big media campaign saying, don't be frightened to get outside your doors, because otherwise we're heading for hell on earth economically, and it's terrifying.
But the strange thing about it, Mitch, is what Bill said, that this has all been presided over by a Conservative government. I mean, Boris only got in December, and so we have the strange sight of a Conservative government splashing the cash like no one could ever have foreseen, and actually, in a strange way, the Westminster government enables the Scottish government, it enables the SNP, for example, through transfer of funds to continue to indulge itself. And what worries me, Mitch, is by virtue of what the Tories are doing, is that actually going to, enable further Scottish nationalism and ultimately separation? Because I think we're all probably unionists on this here. We all want to see the UK, intact. But I feel, from my perspective, what Boris has done helps Nicola in a way that could detonate the union. What do you think?
Well, the Scottish Government are always very thankful for the money, the funding coming from Westminster. However, they always point out that it could be more and it could be used better and it could be obtained more efficiently if Scotland was independent. So there is a bit of an us and them in a sense. This, in a sense, it is empowering the SNP's cause due to, as I said earlier, the daily party political broadcast, and then it gives the nationalists scope and time to thank the English and then bash the English, essentially. We have a coordinated approach, I think, like a Westminster-led coordinated approach. Like, for instance, you've got 5 tiers in Scotland, 3 tiers in England, and a draconian lockdown in Wales. I think that's good for anything or anyone, to be fair.
Yeah. So actually, it's interesting that, Sammy, because from a unionist point of view, it is sort of strange to see the UK breaking into these four parts. Actually, more, because we've got England being fragmented into goodness knows how many different tiers and stuff. And do you think we're losing a kind of what Mitch has said, a kind of a central, coordinated British approach to dealing with this virus?
Well, it was inevitable, of course, with devolution that the powers were devolved to governments, and therefore decisions had been made locally. And to be quite honest, I think that it would probably stoke nationalism in Scotland and Wales far more if Wales were to impose the kinds of rules on Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland that were going to apply in England. So I think the government's probably in a difficult position here. You can't override the devolution settlement. If you do override the devolution settlement, you'll stoke nationalist sentiment, or at least give national fire. So we're stuck with the kind of four-nation approach to this at present. Though, I've got to say, that I suppose the one thing which can, and I know that this has happened in Northern Ireland, one of the things which has maybe reduced the enthusiasm for for separate action here in Northern Ireland has been the fact that they'll not be underwritten by the Exchequer if we take action go beyond what happens in England. So there's always that economic rein, I suppose, on devolved administrations as to how far they can go, because if they go well beyond what is happening in England, then they'll not get payment from the Exchequer to help to bail out the businesses.
And I guess, Bill, as an Englishman, I mean, ultimately, whilst the devolution settlement is what it is, English taxes go a long way towards helping the other regions for different reasons, but ultimately they do. So how do you feel from an English perspective when you do see the likes of the SNP, for example, in Scotland, or the Welsh down in Cardiff, doing things in terms of these COVID regs, which they couldn't afford if it wasn't for your taxes? How do you feel about that?
Well, on principle, I'm a passionate supporter of the union. However, I've always thought that the way that the union will eventually break is through English nationalism, not through the other countries. And the more that these measures are taken, particularly the Welsh government talking about putting roadblocks up to stop the English coming in. And a lot of English people, own properties and businesses in Wales. The more this goes on, the harder the case to the English of keeping the union together becomes. The argument against it is they're spending our taxpayers' money, and they're treating us like dirt. Why are we putting up with this? Now, for those like me who've got a principled position, I'm prepared to take a few more slaps around the face than most. But even I can see that there's something here that is not right. Why on earth are we the bad guys when it's actually largely our taxpayers' money that's being used? There needs to be a little bit more diplomacy and common sense, because the most disastrous thing for any of us in this chat would be the rise of English nationalism, because that would break the union.
And yet, Mitch, I think that's actually happened. I agree with what you said, Bill. But one of the guys who we hope to have in subsequent streams, Toby Young, the commentator and writer and whatnot. Toby wrote an article in the Spectator. I think it was a week or so ago, and he was saying he, like the four of us, he passionately believed in the union, but he's got so irritated by the posturing, especially of Nicola Sturgeon, that it's made him start to think he's an English nationalist, which he never saw himself as. But he's so annoyed at the fact that, oh, you know, we can have tier 4+ in Scotland thanks to English taxes, blah blah blah, and that's annoyed him. So, you know, it is a point that Bill's had, that Bill makes. Is a good point, isn't it?
Well, I actually know some English people who think they should get a vote if there's a independence referendum too in Scotland, because it affects them as well, and they'd maybe want to give Scotland a push. And to be fair, I do understand their point. I try and talk them round, but if their vision and view of Scotland is Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, then they're not going to have a very good outlook on Scotland because of that, which is harmful to the union overall, to be fair.
Mitch, you made, and I see this every day in the House of Commons. I think that nationalists, whether it's in Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland, have now realised that the best hope of gaining independence is to sicken the English. And we have an all-party parliamentary group on the union, and we would discuss how we strengthen the union on a regular basis. And it was actually one of the Labour members made the point one morning in the discussion. He said, look, Sammy, the real threat to the union is not Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland or the SNP in Scotland or Welsh nationalists. The real threat are my constituents who get fed up with you lot. And, you know, I watch the Scottish nationalists, and they play this magnificently in the House of Commons every day.
They're an embarrassment, I'm sorry.
And Mitch, I mean, they use just a tactic you've talked about. They taunt the English. If you were in Scotland, you could have free university education. You could have free prescriptions. You could have, and they go through a whole list of things. And of course, you see all the English ones. They're another, the Conservative on the other side. They're bouncing. Yeah, you've done it with our money of others, you know, kind of thing.
In Scotland, if you're an EU student, you got free education, further and higher education. But if you were English, you had to pay for it.
Yeah.
English, Northern Irish, or Welsh, you had to pay for it. But European Union students would get it for free.
And you know, so, and the coronavirus has been used in the exact same way to try to put this wedge in to sicken the biggest component of the union. And because of a whole lot of economic, geographical, historical reasons, the country, which does subsidise the outer regions, I mean, that's part of the value of the union, that because you're part of a big nation, there are resources that can help the more disadvantaged areas. I'm not a unionist simply for economic reasons, but I realise the economic benefits of the union. But I think coronavirus has been used to weaken that link and to target English people and say, look, these lot, they get resources from us, they're ungrateful, they then taunt us about it. What is the value of the union? And I know it's not the topic we're discussing here tonight, David, but it's one of the reasons I think that those of us who believe passionately in the union, I mean, I believe in the union. People died in Northern Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom, but I think that we do have to address very, very seriously the point that Bill's made.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also think, I mean, you're going to wrap this up in a sec, but, you know, I think one of the definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And when it comes to COVID-19, I think we're in the asylum, because at this point in time, they are wanting to do the same thing over and over again. And I think there's a general consensus amongst us that, look, that's just not going to work. And we do need to look to the principles behind Great Barrington. We need to look at finding ways to take care of the most vulnerable, but at the same time, open our economies up, create, get those unemployment numbers down. Sammy and Bill have both mentioned the young generation, young people, and the fact that, I mean, they're facing a scenario which is, I remember I came out of university back in the early 80s, and that's when I remember unemployment was about, I think it was 15% or something. It was very high anyway, and it was very, very difficult. And now we're heading steamrolling back towards those times. So, so in summary, if I can just go around each, if you start with you, Mitch, what is the thing you would most like to see happen right now if you were in power with regard to COVID?
I would cease all lockdowns. I would scrap the tier 5, tier 3 system, and I would shield the vulnerable, but it would be optional, and I would basically enforce a Great Barrignton Declaration.
Okay.
Immediate handbrake turn, enforce the Great Barrignton Declaration, and have an emergency budget with the tax cuts in it that I think we need to get the economy kick-started again.
Spirit of Thatcherism beats deeply within you, Bill. Sammy, what would you like to? What is the thing you'd most like to see happen?
The thing I'd most like to see happen is a commitment from the government that we will not be engaging anymore in the kind of lockdown policies of the past. We will target those particular sectors of the economy or sectors of society that most need support to get through coronavirus, that we will make the health service and spend some of the money that we were spending on these other schemes to make the health service more resilient to peaks in infections, and, as Bill has said, then get down to the serious job of restoring some of our economic prosperity. And I think that he's right. That requires us to accept that in the short term we're going to have to increase some investment spending and also to reduce taxes to encourage private people to put money back into the economy, because there is still money there which can be put back in to get the economic bounce back. And the last is stop project fear and give people some confidence to go out and carry on life as normal.
Well, look, on that positive note from everyone, I want to just wrap things up, but can I thank each of you very much for taking up this time from your evening and having the whole point of Open Dialogus is to have civilized, sensible discussion. You know, this is not the kind of the cockpit of the legacy media where it's a 30-second soundbite. It's about exploring ideas, and I think that's what we've done in this one. So to those watching, thanks for being part of this. To let you know, we'll be back next week to discuss, I think there's an election somewhere next week. Oh yeah, that one. We're going to discuss that week, and then the week after, we're going to discuss something which we thought would have been the big topic for 2020, Brexit, and our final separation from our friends across the channel. So we've got lots of interesting programs ahead. You can follow us on www.opendialogus.co.uk, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and hope to catch up with you folks all this time next week. In the meantime, good night from me, and thanks again to all the panelists. Good night.